Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your location. Welcome to the series, Viewing Multidimensional Poverty from Many Angles, coming to you from Oxford University in Oxford, UK, the George Washington University in Washington, DC, and the United Nations in New York City. I'm James Foster, Chair at George Washington University, joining you here from London at the LSE, where I'm located while on sabbatical. This is the fourth episode of our present series, which explores the Multidimensional Poverty Index in theory and in practice. I'm here today with Jacob Dirksen of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, who is live in the seminar room in Oxford's Department of International Development in Queen Elizabeth House, or QEH, where he is valiantly trying to keep an unruly audience under control. Isn't that right, Jacob?
Absolutely. Everyone's at the edge of their seat.
Fantastic. So along with our colleagues at the Human Development Report Office in UNDP, we're pleased to offer today's presentation, Multidimensional Poverty in Europe, a Longitudinal Perspective, presented by Nicolai Suppa of Barcelona and OPHI, with discussion by Philippe Van Kerm of Luxembourg. In just a moment, Jacob will introduce today's speakers to you. But first, I'd like to thank the many supporters of our sponsoring units for providing the financial and non-monetary resources that help keep IIEP, OPHI, and HDRO at the top of their game, producing research and programming intended to enhance human development and reduce human suffering. Last week, I accompanied Kristen Schenbroek and Mauricio Apablasa up to Oxford from the LSE to present their work on multiple employment deprivations, while Josephine Passanen of the HDRO provided really interesting comments. Next week in this series, we'll be joined by Piotr Paradowski, Jörg Nieuwswendy, and Heba Omar, all from the Luxembourg Income Studies Cross-National Data Center in Luxembourg, who will show us how to measure risk of poverty with income and wealth. Please join us then. But if you happen to miss an event, you can always catch reruns on the YouTube channel IIEP GW. Now over to you, Jacob, for an introduction of the series and today's participants. Jacob?
Thank you so much, James. And first of all, also from Oxford and to everyone here in Oxford, good afternoon, and thank you for taking the time to joining us here for the seminar. Also, good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone online, wherever you are. Very glad that you are with us. The series is a joint venture by IIEP, represented by James, even though in London at the moment, the Human Development Report Office, and ourselves, OPHI, here at the University of Oxford. And what we try to do in this seminar series is to bring policymakers, international organizations and institutions, as well as academics together to discuss exciting new research and applications of multidimensional poverty measurement in academic context, as well as in policy context. And we're truly delighted to have our very own Nicolai Suppa presenting his new research on multidimensional poverty in Europe, a longitudinal perspective, to us today. Nicolai is research associate with us here in Oxford, although ordinarily based in Barcelona, where he is a Juan de la Sierra Research Fellow at the Center for Demographic Studies. And we're also very happy that Philippe Van Kerm, who is a professor of inequality and social policy at the University of Luxembourg, in a joint appointment with the Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research, or LISA, was able to join us today as discussant for Nicolai's paper. Thank you so much, Philippe, for being here with us. Philippe is also associated with the Institute for New Economic Thinking here in Oxford. So in a sense, also a local resident and representative, academically speaking. Before I hand over to our speaker, Nicolai, who's going to talk for about 30 minutes, followed by discussion remarks and then questions and answers. Just a note to everyone online and also here in the room that the webinar seminar is going to be recorded, so anything you say will be on the record. And especially for people here in the room, the microphones are very sensitive. So later on when we ask questions and there's a gossip going on in the back of the room, that will all be live and on the record, just so that you're aware. For the online audience, after the presentation and Philippe's discussant remarks, you'll have the chance to put your questions into the Q&A box, or also to raise your hand, and then we can bring you into the conversation and discussion. So with that, unless James, you have any further remarks, I think we are ready to hand over to Nicolai for his presentation.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for the nice introduction. So today I will present work on multidimensional poverty in Europe, a longitudinal perspective. This is work in progress, and the results are also still preliminary. And actually, much of the work is about how to study multidimensional poverty dynamics at the micro level using panel data. So that's the kind of background for this paper here. So a brief introduction or a motivation. So I think in this audience, we don't have to explain why multidimensional poverty measures are important, how they can inform policy, and we also know that they are very popular. But one of the things we know less about is the microdynamics. And there are two reasons for that, at least. One is the availability of data, because we need panel data to study dynamics at the micro level. And for many countries around the world, this is still not available, or if it's available, it's usually short run or selected waves or rounds of data only. But there is a second aspect, namely the question, how should we study poverty dynamics at the micro level with our multidimensional poverty measures? In some sense, yeah, so there is already work on or with longitudinal data. And Sabina and colleagues have been studying the chronicity of poverty, on the one hand with Chilean data, but also with with the EOSILC as well. And the motivation was more to measure or to quantify the persistently poor. So that's one line of research that you can actually do. Then also in some of my own work, I was trying to explore transitions in poverty and its deprivations, which is our usual multidimensional context, more specifically with short-run panel data, because for most of the countries, we cannot expect to have, I mean, ideally, we have life cycle data or even over generations, but this won't happen in the near future. So the question is, how can we use short-run panels to study year-to-year transitions? And this is a bit more complicated in multidimensional poverty case because we have transitions in both deprivation status and poverty status for most of the measures. There is, of course, also previous research on monetary poverty, on monetary poverty dynamics, and various questions have been studied there. Just to give you a sense, persistence is one of the questions to quantify it, duration, dependence, state dependence, but also what are the events associated with poverty entries and exits. And also in that literature, at some point, the models became more sophisticated and more complex. And at some point, I think it's fair to say that, well, the focus was more on methods that can also be applied in short or mid-run panels to be more relevant in practice. So that's also an observation in that literature. So what is the research question here? So in one sentence, did deprivations accumulate or decouple over the course of the last year? So I think there are kind of two components attached to this. One is there a way how we can use short-run panel data sets to learn about processes which usually occur in the mid-run? So health, for instance, deteriorates usually in the mid-run unless you have a accident or something. And a related question is also, is it possible with this data to provide a kind of policy indicator that can be computed on an annual basis to inform policymakers about how transition or how deprivation decoupled or accumulated over the last year? Maybe it turns out that these things cannot be studied separately, but for now I will cover them together. So what is the hypothesis that I'm going to explore is, essentially, it's a variant of this one as formulated here. The question is, are multidimensionally poor people more likely to enter a new deprivation, which they do not yet experience, and less likely to leave an existing deprivations, which they do already experience, than comparable non-poor? Comparable means here and I have to emphasize that several times, it's not as we usually understand it in the treatment evaluation literature, which is much more demanding, but rather it means like we want to compare poor but non-deprived in a particular indicator against non-poor and non-deprived in that particular indicator. I will come back to that in a bit. So what I'm doing in terms of data and measure, so I'm using the EU Silk. I'm currently covering about approximately 20 countries. I'm only using the longitudinal component here. And I'm not innovating on the measurement itself. I'm rather using what has been done in previous work, although I have comments and reservations on that, but that's not the core of this paper here. The empirical approach, to give you a preview, is, I think, what might be interesting is to analyze the differences in deprivation transition probabilities, meaning entry and exit probabilities for deprivations. And I will argue that the relevant, I will show that the relevant transition probabilities may be obtained from a single model per indicator, and it can even be a linear model. And selected findings, as a preview, is broadly speaking, the evidence is supporting the hypothesis. There are, although, various caveats in terms of interpretation. And what is interesting is there is some stability over time, if you want, although there is variation. It's like the differences are not completely different each other year. But there is also cross-country heterogeneity that we can observe. That's just to give you a sense of what direction the presentation is heading. Now, let me talk a bit more about the data, which I'm using and how I'm using it. So in principle, I'm using EU Silk longitudinal component. I focus on the period of 2017 to 2020, mostly for reasons of indicator comparability, because changes have been introduced in some of the indicator-related questions at some point. And you see here a set of the countries which I'm using. I'm not using all of the available countries for different reasons. Sometimes a particular indicator is not available. Sometimes I have doubts about certain features of the survey data sets of some countries. But this is, I will focus anyway only on selected results later. Now, maybe most of you know that the EU Silk has a specific rotating panel structure. And how does that work? And how am I using this? So in principle, you see on the x-axis the years for the survey, and on the y-axis you see the rotational group, which is essentially a subsample for the panel. And this subsample starts in one particular year, is followed for example, 4 years, and then replaced by a new one. So if we have, for example, a panel with 4 rotational groups, we have in each period, as here, for example, indicated, 4 different rotational groups observed between 2019 and 20. Now, how would we use this kind of data? The data is shipped in 2 ways, longitudinal and cross-sectional format. The cross-sectional one would be the blue box here, which would make use of all subsamples for a particular year for efficiency reasons. Each of them is in principle a random sample and should be representative, although there is evidence for a rotational group bias. But then there's also the longitudinal sample, which comprises different durations, as indicated by the red box, which it covers up to 4 years for each of the data files. How am I using this? Well, I mean, this depends on the research question. If I wanted to study chronicity for 4 years, I would simply pick the lowest row, for example, here, to have one sample following over 4 years over the same period of the same years. But in this case, I'm interested in year-to-year changes. So I'm focusing for efficiency reasons on the samples, which are plotted here in gray. There are different reasons for why I'm choosing this. The year-to-year focus is one, but it's also, I started to scale up the analysis from a single country and a single year to several years. It's also useful for the policy indicator interest, so how to compute it every year. And also I wanted to avoid, well, although it's only a partially convincing argument, I wanted to avoid observations to be correlated over time, but I think it's something one has to think about more carefully anyway soon. And so it's open to revision, I would say. Now, yeah, so the year-to-year change is for each year in each country. It's constructed a sample like the one indicated or shaded here in gray. This is a brief overview of how the sample sizes look like, but I won't discuss this in detail to save time. I will be also very brief on measurement of multidimensional poverty because we should be familiar here with that. But in principle, we have the index E, which is for the individuals we are studying. We have n individuals, and now we consider also small t periods. Small t is the index for the periods of time. We have t periods of time here. We have J different. Index J indicates the achievements. We have D different achievements, which are positive, and then we construct our deprivation indicators using a particular threshold, and whenever the achievement is less than its threshold, we consider the individual to be deprived. Then we also have our normative weights, and we can construct our deprivation score here by summing up the weighted deprivation here. And finally, we can identify somebody, an individual, as poor in period T if the respective weighted deprivation score is larger than the critical or larger or equal than the critical cutoff. In principle, I could stop here because what I'm focusing on is deprivation status here and poverty status. This is key for the analysis. Nonetheless, of course, we can also define the set of the poor, the number of the poor, and the aggregate measures, headcount ratio, intensity, or adjusted headcount ratio. But they are not the focus of this particular piece of research. This is broadly the specification I'm using, and I wouldn't say it's my preferred one, but it's more or less in line with the literature. I just want to make a few brief comments on why it's here, why I'm opted for some of those indicators. So there is no innovation. There are limitations for using the longitudinal component. Not all the indicators we would like to use are available in the longitudinal component. Some things are only distributed in the cross-sectional part of the data. Then I think I saw Kirsten around, and so I should mention that low work intensity is not my preferred employment measure either, but it's one that is it's a more or less official one for the EU indicator, so I'm using it. One could choose something more elaborate and convincing. And a similar argument applies actually also to the income dimension, which one could easily argue there could be a debate whether we want to include income into multidimensional poverty measures. We also could argue that it should be studied better separate. The reason why I'm including it here is in part because I actually also want to cover it in a uniform way in the analysis of transitions. But that's brief, so I'll leave it at that. And I will use a non-union poverty cutoff, which is important, approximately 30, so 1/3 of the possible deprivations. Now, what is the motivation or the theoretical background? The motivation for the hypothesis. So how can we formulate them? And the idea is that initial deprivations which are present beget further deprivations, obviously in other achievements. And reformulating again, or being explicit about the hypothesis, is multidimensionally poor individuals are more likely to enter a new deprivation and less likely to leave an already existing deprivation than comparable non-poor, meaning non-poor who are not yet deprived in a particular dimension. We want to compare the entry probability and the exit probability for those who are already deprived in that dimension. Now, these would be we can reformulate that as conditional probabilities of interest. So let's focus on the first two lines. The first two lines is the probability of being deprived in T in a particular indicator J. Conditional on, both lines are conditional on being not deprived in the previous year, but they differ in terms of the poverty status. So conditional on being poor in the last period, non-poor in the last period, or poor in the last period. So, and the difference between those two would give us the difference in the transition probability of entering a new deprivation conditional on being not deprived in the previous year. Now we can formulate the same conditional probabilities for deprivation exit probabilities, which are the equation 3 and 4 here. So it's a probability to be not deprived in T, conditional for both of being deprived in T-1 over here, but then the difference is poor or non-poor. Sorry, the other way around, non-poor and poor. So this would be, with this conditional probabilities of interest, we can formulate the hypothesis more specifically. Namely, the first one would be that the probability, the deprivation entry probability for multidimensional poor is larger than the entry probability of the non-poor. So that difference here should be positive. Second, or accordingly, the deprivation exit probability, which is given here for the poor, it's the upper one. This one should be smaller than that deprivation exit probability of the non-poor, which is the lower one. So that difference should be negative. The question is also what we could study, and whether there is a difference in terms of the difference between exit and entry probabilities. So does the poverty status play a different role, or does it, well, it induce, it's not causing for sure, a different differential for entry and exit probabilities? And the related hypothesis is also, and sorry, I didn't explain. So, and ad hoc, it's like not clear why they should be the same. So there might be good cases to study them separately, entries and exits. So this is why we would try to reject equality of those differences, the absolute value. And then we are also interested, or it's natural to ask, whether deprivations are persistent. And one way to formulate that is that those who are already deprived in the previous period are actually more likely to be deprived in the current period than those who were not deprived in the previous period. That's one way of how we can formulate deprivation persistence and test that. Now, some remarks, I will be brief on that, just to get a better understanding of what we are covering in this framework. So we had transition probabilities, and we can immediately, from that formulation, we can immediately obtain staying probabilities, which are essentially their complementary probabilities. So we have the same part on which we condition here, and we have here those who are deprived in period t-1. So this is then the staying probability to be deprived also in t itself. So this is the staying probability for deprivations, and this is the staying probability for non-deprivation. And they can be obtained 1 minus the transition probability. I want to make 2 brief remarks on the timing structure. In some sense, often we study the same question using different data sets. So, for example, we're interested in a particular relation between 2 variables. We sometimes have cross-section data, sometimes we have before and after data, and sometimes the data also allows to have some DID setup, difference in different setup, for example. And the assumptions, when we're interested in describing a particular relation, are different in each of the settings. Usually, the more data we have, the less demanding the assumptions are. And I just want to describe one aspect here in terms of the timing structure, namely any kind of correlation, that's remark 2, any kind of correlation between the current poverty status and the current deprivation status is usually for studying that link that we are interested in here, whether poor are more likely to enter a new deprivation or exit an existing one. This information cannot be really used here because this kind of correlation contains always mechanical correlation, because by construction, in our case, certain deprivation result in poverty in the same period. And one aspect to emphasize in that, or to highlight in that context, is that panel data per se doesn't resolve that, because any correlation that we would observe between past poverty status and current deprivation status, partly it could be a behavioral component, which we try to understand and describe better, but partly it could be the same kind of mechanical correlation induced by the way we measure how we identify multidimensionally poor. So what really matters is the second part of conditioning as well. So conditioning on the deprivation status. Now, how does the empirical approach look like? Well, how can we obtain the transition probabilities of interest? So we are interested in the end in average predicted probabilities from a dynamic binary choice model. How could that work? This is how we can obtain them. In principle, we could consider a sample of only non-deprived in t-1 and estimate the model for deprivation entry, so the probability of being deprived is equal 1 in period t. And we have a simple model here with a single regressor, the poverty status. And we could do the same thing with a different sign, so to say, for that sample of those who are deprived in t-1, so this part here, and estimate the exit probability. This approach would work, but it's inefficient because we can actually do that together, which is a common well understood problem in econometrics. So joint estimation would be preferable. What we would do then, however, is not only have a regressor for explanatory variable for poverty status, but also for the deprivation status and the interaction of the two. And the interaction is, so one motivation for that is to allow for the differential impact of poverty on deprivation entries and exits. That's the one way to motivate that. Oh, sorry, and yeah. And then if we would estimate such a model, we could do a good job with margins and stata and compute the conditional probabilities as we would need. However, because we're interested in average predicted probabilities, we could actually even use a linear model if we use robust standard errors, because they have to be heteroscedastic, because the outcome is binary, but they deliver virtually identical results. So between the average predicted probabilities between the two models are similar to at least digit 3 or so. So this is the model we can actually estimate. And why does that make sense at all? Of course, it's a bit faster, but that doesn't really count given current or nowadays computing power. But what is more convenient is that for each of the parameters, we can actually connect them very nicely to test the hypothesis and with respect to the conditional probabilities that we can obtain with such a model. For example, the parameter alpha would give us immediately the probability of being not deprived in t-1, not poor in t-1, but deprived in t. All the others are then equal, all the variables are 0. So that's the interpretation for that coefficient for alpha. And the same way, beta would tell us here the probability to enter a particular deprivation, given that the past deprivation status is 0, but the past poverty status is 1. So that's the probability A alpha plus beta. And then we have here the deprivation exit probabilities. We have to be a bit careful because it's the complementary probability now. And then we can actually use that to formulate, to connect that, or to connect that with the hypothesis we had. So the beta itself gives us the difference in entry and exit probabilities. And the beta and the delta together gives us the difference in deprivation exit probabilities. And the gamma itself, which is the coefficient here of the deprivation status and past poverty, tells us something about the persistence of deprivations. So broadly, this is the way we can interpret that. Interesting special cases include here, for example, that if delta, one example is if beta plus delta is 0, this would essentially mean the poverty status matters for deprivation entries, but not at all for deprivation exits. So there, poor would be not more likely or less likely to leave a given deprivation. Now let's have a look at some of the results. I will be brief, obviously. Just I want to make some few remarks. Here you have results for 2 countries in 2 years. Again, this is the change from 2019 to 20. Let's only have a look at the results for Spain on the lower panel. You see 1 column per indicator. The broad observation is, in many cases, the coefficients are significantly positive for the betas, so the coefficient of the poverty status, and usually also for the coefficients of the deprivation status, indicating persistence. And the interaction term tends to be insignificant or significantly positive, although that varies with the countries. So one has to be careful not to overinterpret. Broadly speaking, this supports in the first place that poor are more likely to enter a new deprivation. And there is also persistence of deprivations. So let me speed up. Of course, what you see here is that in some cases, we don't observe, for example, here we have 0 deprivation exits, so we cannot estimate. And I also didn't estimate for if there are only 10 observations or so. One way to present the results is also this. A single country, you see it for all deprivation indicators, but you see the differential for each year. So what do we see? Let's consider just one deprivation indicator. Over here, this is a material and social deprivation indicator. And we see the red dots for 2000, we have for each year. The red dots indicate the difference in the entry probability, deprivation entry probability. And this is usually larger than 0.1. So essentially, this means that poor are 10 percentage points more likely to enter the deprivation of material, so material deprivation, than non-poor who are not yet deprived in that indicator. And the blue the blue bullets or dots instead indicate the difference in deprivation exit probabilities, meaning here that poor are less in that case, about 20 percentage points less likely to leave a given an experienced deprivation in material and social deprivation index than non-poor. Broadly, that can be observed over different indicators. Also note that the hollow markers here indicate that the difference is insignificant. So in most cases, it's also significant. Now, what happens in general? So this is one country, 1 year. What do we observe in general? This is a summary. So we see, so we have to digest that a bit. It's an unconventional figure, I believe. This graph shows pooled estimates for some 20 plus countries, usually for 4 years, for 4 different changes. It shows the difference in transition probabilities by indicator. So the indicator is here on the y-axis. And it shows also by direction. So red dots indicate the difference in entry probabilities, blue dots, the difference in exit probabilities. Usually, as expected, the entry probability difference is positive, meaning poor are more likely to enter that particular deprivation. Whereas the blue dots are negative, meaning the exit probability is usually smaller for poor than non-poor. And again, hollow markers indicate insignificant results. You also have here, to get a sense of what happens in the different cases, you have the information about the distribution. The cross here is the median, and we also have the interquartile range to get a sense. So broadly speaking, this figure suggests that the sign is as expected. There are, however, interesting exceptions, because we observe, for instance, even the wrong sign in quotation marks. So that's something I would like to come back. So this is like, you see, this was an overview of the results, but the question is, okay, how far can we go in terms of interpretation for dynamics? What are the caveats? What are the next steps? How can this information be used? First, I want to state very clearly, this cannot be causally interpreted for different reasons. I want to just mention, well, essentially it's 2 reasons, I would argue. One is there is no identification strategy here. We don't even try to distinguish observed and unobserved heterogeneity, which might be correlated with poverty status. Of course, it would be nice to address that, but I'm not sure how trivial that is or how straightforward that is. I've been thinking about that, and maybe we can explore that, but it's not super easy and to implement. But there is a second component why causality is, one should be careful with causal claims, is namely, we study poverty status. And in our case, poverty status can be made up by different combinations of poverty profiles. So technically, different mechanisms could be involved why deprivations are accumulating. And then we are actually back to last term's presentation on poverty profiles, so the interlinkage. But that's something I don't want to explore at this stage and to bring that in. But it's just to mention that in principle, different theoretical mechanisms could result in what we observe. Now, one thing is, which takes a bit of time, I think, so what exactly do the differences in these transition probabilities reflect? They change a bit over time, but they also change across countries, which I didn't show you clearly now. So what do they reflect? On the one hand, I think they can reflect more structural components, like the functioning of a healthcare system. To which extent do you need resources, income, time, education to get the most out of, or to get good treatment in the healthcare system? That could be one thing where this is reflected. So if you're already deprived in education and material deprivation, it might be more likely that you enter health deprivation as well, for example. This is a structural component, but there can also be a kind of more temporal component, which is changing more over time, something like the business cycle, employment probabilities, employers' decisions, but also labor market regulation. And one thing, how to think about that is, imagine there was a perfectly targeted a policy measure bringing exactly those individuals who are suffering, experiencing low working intensity, bringing all those individuals back into employment. How would this difference in the transition probabilities look like? Actually, it would become positive because it's largely those who are deprived and poor who would actually leave that deprivation in a particular year. So in some sense, there might be a case, I subject that to discussion, I would say, there might be a case to interpret the difference as a kind of net effect. One has to be careful because we still don't take unobserved and observed heterogeneity properly into account. But one way could be to think about it that if we observe in quotation marks the right sign as formulated in the hypothesis, this would be usually anti-poor experience in the year. If the probability is equal, it would be neutral. And if the poor are actually more likely to leave a deprivation, that would be pro-poor. That is one thing I would like to subject to discussion. So I think my time is up. I should wrap up. One thing I just want to make as a final comment is the last one, the third point here. Actually, this approach is not necessarily limited to multidimensional poverty. As it happens, you could use any other, it works, it could work. I believe it's of value for multidimensional poverty analysis, the dynamic aspect, but it could also be used for, say, income poverty and deprivation in employment, whatever way that measure. So we could ask the question whether it's largely the income poor, or whether the income poor are less likely to leave a particular deprivation. So that's just something to keep in mind, that might be an interesting application too. Because actually, well, yeah, I will stop here. Thank you. And looking forward to the discussion now and questions.
Great. So let's move on to the discussant, Philippe.
Well, of course, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper and in this audience, but I'll jump straight to the discussion. I think most of my discussion, as you're going to see, is reflecting the comments of someone that doesn't know this literature very well. You know, I'm obviously coming from the income poverty dynamics perspectives, and I'm sure that's going to be reflected in my comments here. But there's certainly one thing that I fully appreciate is actually all the work that's going on under the hood. I mean, it's just, I mean, there's a lot that you need to do to get to the point that you reach, and a short presentation as you did doesn't do justice to the work involved in getting that sort of work out of the longitudinal EU seek. But anyhow, let me get to the meat of it, and I think what's really interesting in what you did here is that the dynamics really help getting a sense of, you know, the mechanisms at play underlying the multidimensional poverty and poverty measures, and I think that's really important, because that's really what can be frustrating when you look at it from, you know, a non-specialist perspective, is that, of course, an aggregate measure of multidimensional poverty is reflecting a combination of multiple things by definition. But I think what's interesting in the work that you do here in looking at the dynamics is that we start getting a better sense of what's sort of driving what's going on under these aggregate measures. But that being said, I think my main comment is that I would really like to see more of it, and that's where I want to elaborate upon here. Okay, salient observations. I think my summary is the same as yours. I mean, what you'll find is that you confirm that there's dimensions are correlated, there's correlated dynamics, and that one really needs to look into that. And I think that's, well, obvious if you like, but I think it's very important to put that into the empirics. So I was sort of surprised that overall, I mean, if you look at from a bird's eye perspective, there's the sort of similarity in the responsiveness of all dimensions in the aggregate poverty status. I mean, there seems that material deprivation, income appears to be somewhat more dependent on aggregate poverty, education and work intensity less so, right? But what is also striking, I think, there's very large variations across countries and years. So, I mean, there's two ways to read that. I mean, one is that and I think that's my reading, is that there are indeed lessons to be learned from the cross-dimension dynamics and how they might be context dependent. By context dependent, I mean different countries and in different time periods. But of course, that makes interpreting the set of results sort of complicated. All right, so essentially I have four types of specific questions and comments on the paper to be, let's call it. One is on the economic specification. One is, I'm sorry, I have to raise these vexing issues, which I'm going to get into. And then I've got some more minor implementation choices, points, and one suggestion. And so the main point that relates to the modern is, well, once we start looking at, understanding what's going on underneath the aggregate index, I mean, it feels to me that sort of the aggregation into multidimensional poverty as a predictor of future dimensional poverty, sort of hides more than it really reveals. And well, because, I mean, you alluded to that already, because I think there are asymmetric relationships across dimensions. I mean, not all of them influence each other in similar ways. And once you look at the listing, I mean, there are clearly very different intrinsic dynamics in different dimensions, which sort of is all the components that probably led you to say that, of course, there's these profiles of poverty, and it depends on what dimension you're pouring into. But I think I think it would be important to get to the bottom of that, or at least sort of dig into it a little more. So I mean, sort of fairly straight, obvious points is that, looking at different intrinsic dynamics, well, sort of displayed here, what I think could be a potential ordering from dimensions which are the least fluid or the least dynamic to those that are the most dynamic. And of course, education, and it sort of shows up in the result that you see, there's essentially no dynamics in education. And you found mostly, in the example, you found no exits, you found entries, which is very sort of surprising to see people entering into very low education. So, I mean, education would agree, there's not really any dynamics here. But, at the other end of the spectrum, if you look at self-reported health, I mean, this could vary a lot from one survey to the other survey. Very different sort of dynamics. And in between the two, I mean, you could think of housing conditions to be a bit more fluid than education, but much less than say income or employment or material deprivation. I mean, that's sort of, you may want to sort of slide the components differently, but you got the gist. I think there's very different dynamics across dimensions, and would want to have a look at that. Now, the other point is about asymmetric relationships. So I think I was sort of trying to think for myself of what could be the potential relationships. Like, I mean, when I say relationships, direct relationships, not just associations. And it's sort of looking at it, I was sort of, which one of those would influence those here? And I said, well, education, yes, I mean, clearly this could directly influence income, employment, material deprivation, possibly health. I could think of direct effects here, multiple direct effects. But I was sort of looking at housing, but housing could influence directly. But I could think, yes, it may. Poor housing conditions might influence health, maybe a year after. But I found it a little hard to think of obvious direct effects of housing on other dimensions. Income, well, yes, somewhere in between the two. Income obviously influences future housing conditions and health and material deprivation. I think that money could buy, it would be influenced. But yes, you see, you get the gist. There's lots of different direct effects that one could think of, which means that depending on the profile, I mean, depending on which dimensions a person's poor at T-1, the impact that poverty is going to have on different dimensions is going to be very different depending on what dimensions the person's into. So that sort of is a long way to say that what I would really like to see is in fact, allowing for heterogeneity in the composition of poverty at the starting period, at T-1. So sort of trying to have a model where the probability to be deprived in dimension J is in fact a function of all the profile of all deprivations in period T minus I, rather than having J and then all the rest sort of pulled into the poverty status. I think that would really get into, I don't think, I mean, it's a bit, of course it's more complicated, but I think it remains feasible. And I mean, that sort of would get into getting what's influencing what and really get into understanding the mechanisms. Or of course, you do allow for cross equation correlations and things like that, but I think that would really be quite interesting. Now, okay, the vexing issue. I'm sorry, I have to raise it. Having worked with EU Silk, it's selective attrition. Participation is very much correlated with deprivation, and if you look at the dynamics, there's one thing that people could do is just drop out of the survey rather than being more deprived or less deprived in the second period. So you could, I mean, Lorenzo Capellaris and Jensens have sort of looked into it, tried to have an equation for retention in that same sort of model. It's painful. I mean, you need to find instruments for participation, which could be hard, especially in EU Silk. But I think it seems unavoidable to try and look into that, especially because you're looking at the most disadvantaged populations in the pool, for whom attrition might most likely be very important. Okay, implementation choices. You may want to discuss income dimensions. I mean, 40% of median income, really very low. I think the signal to noise might become problematic here. I might just pick up measurement error in the dynamics. And another, troubling point is that, EU Silk income is in fact at period T is reflecting calendar T-1 calendar year, and so that's unclear how that sort of plays out with the dynamics in the other dimensions, which might be measured at T, etc. So I think for potentially complicated things here. And then I'll make that point and then skip the rest. I was wondering whether you really want to work with the 2020 data series. Of course, it's COVID, so it's COVID, which means it was hard to collect the data during the confinement. Does it lead to some sort of spurious dynamics because data collections have changed? Because possibly some specific populations were harder to reach and then dropped out. That relates to the attrition problem. And then, of course, the substantive effects of COVID-19. I mean, that's just things have happened in 2020, which didn't necessarily happen before that. So, it might kind of make the overall picture harder to read, and especially if you want to focus on understanding the mechanism. So, I was wondering whether you wouldn't want to drop 2020 from the analysis. Yeah, I mean, that's the usual question when you see, do you want to look at all countries or a subset of countries? I mean, does it add information or does it add noise to have more? I mean, I like the graph, the way you summarize all the results for all the countries and the different time periods, but still, it's hard to, especially when you're sort of having lots of heterogeneity across countries, it's hard to know which is which. And I think that's what you said. I think it would be interesting to see that work on other multidimensional indices like the ROP index at risk of poverty and social exclusion, or the material deprivation index directly. And that's it. Thanks very much. Interesting materials. Thanks for giving me the chance to comment on.
Wonderful, both presentations, succinct, clear, really appreciate it. I wonder if Jacob has some questions in the Oxford audience, otherwise I'll hop in.
Not at the moment, everyone's still digesting, but we'll let you know once we have some here. Go ahead, James.
Okay, I have one question indeed, following up on what Philippe said. There has been a lot of work on the creating of profiles of deprivations and therefore associating a lot of different things with different profiles. What's great about that is that you have this commonality. People are considered to be poor under this approach, but the differentiation between them is also quite interesting information, and we can obviously recover that at any point. So therefore, not losing the information that we actually continue to have. But you can differentiate, and importantly so, between, let's say, the 5 top profiles across, let's say, a country, and see what's happening with that type of profile for those types of profiles differently dynamically. Have you thought of that, Nicolai?
Sure. First, thank you very much for the comments. Very helpful and much appreciated. I mean, also it's good to hear from more experienced EOSILC people who work with EOSILC that they consider these issues still to be vexing. So it's not only once you get into this. Yeah, maybe some reflections or responses to across the board. I definitely was thinking about the different profiles. Actually, but the reason why I didn't do it so far is because there are several substantial issues I would to address. I'm not sure whether I can address all of them or should address all of them in one go. One thought I had is like, obviously, it relates also to the volatility or like the fluidness of the indicators. One could argue maybe it's not poverty, maybe it's just education that is really driving the deprivation in education is maybe really driving your findings. And I was thinking, okay, once I go this direction, in particular that we had just last year, the interlinkage work going on, it's like, I wouldn't know where to stop actually, once you open that kind of box. And so definitely it's something I wanted to look into, at least for selected indicators, maybe, which are part of the poverty profile, maybe something along that line, or maybe as James suggested, the most common profiles. That could be one thing. One problem is, I mean, I think in some sense it's natural, as you call the natural approach to put the entire profile into in T-1 in. But already now, I mean, the starting point was I don't really know what the data will allow me to do with the analysis. And already now I see substantial variation in terms of transitions that I actually observe in the different countries. So when I start to condition more and differentiate more, I wonder to which extent that in the end may still work. It's something where I was like, I didn't follow that way further down, but I think education would be most likely a candidate to look into. And actually also this also connects with another point that you made on the fluidness. Some people argue that education in this case is not really a good indicator because it's pretty much a stock indicator because there is so little variation in that. I mean, this opens the debate to which extent we want to have stock indicators in. There are good reasons for having them, for excluding them. I mean, there are arguments, of course, like, and also it matters whether the measure is identifying individuals or households. At the moment, it's individuals. I'm making use of that. But there would be more variation potentially if households are allowed to form and dissolve over time. That could be studied separately and adding kind of a certain form of variation. So yeah, so that's yeah. I mean, in many MPIs we have education in. I mean, the question is whether one could also measure it in different ways that it covers better improvements. Because in the end, we want to have, and that's also like in the spirit of Atkinson's recommendations on indicators, that they should be subject to policy change. So even if it's intrinsically important to measure a particular shortfall in, say, education or health, do we want to have that as an indicator, even if it's perfectly measuring the functioning deprivation, if we cannot change it by policymakers? Do we want to have that in or not? I'm not sure whether it's trivial to answer. So maybe one comment on the direct effects. Actually, I was considering to add 2-3 references near the deprivations beget deprivations, but there is quite a literature on, I mean, different literatures actually that document those effects. I was considering in that moment where I would open or study the profiles, that may make more sense to be more explicit about that. But certainly there were like material deprivation health. I mean, for a proper analysis, we need to talk more explicitly about the mechanisms for sure. Actually, an interesting point, it's semi-related. It relates to a different piece because originally I was pooling this with some related research on the mismatch on income and multidimensional poverty measures in the EOSILC. And actually, I'm exploring there the question to which extent the income reference period matters, because it's actually different. And but that points to a different direction of of analysis. But in principle, it can explain to some extent mismatch, but not fully. So it's like there is something to that, but it cannot explain why they are so substantially different. But that's a different piece of research. And also, but originally it was part of that, but this one grew and grew and grew more and more. So it's now this is standalone. And 2020, it's a good point. I mean, starting point here is also, it was available. I just want to look into this and see what kind of odd things might be going on. So I was careful. I mean, because some things changed. Obviously, the modus for interviewing changed and went to telephone in most countries, I think. Although the pandemic was also, one would have to look more carefully at interview date and lockdowns and everything. So potentially there might be differences. I didn't see strong differences in terms of indicator changes for Spain. I was looking, so I started with Spain naturally and later scaled up. So there was nothing that was completely at odds with my expectation, although I agree that I don't want to open that debate. This is not part here, so I would rather focus. In case of doubt, I would ignore. For now, this is in, just to see how the data performs in the analysis. But of course, I mean, I would be worried that that I capture their potentially that I get into COVID effects in terms of responses and different changes in response behavior and so on. Related to COVID changes, there was something else I wanted to. No, the vaccine issue. Actually, it's one of the things I was considering how important. I mean, given many difficult issues, how important is the vaccine one compared with the other? So I would try not. So I'm not trying to address all of the issues in one go. I'm aware of that work, and I think it's nice to have like an explicit modeling of the probability to exit. So it's not to be so for attrition. But I wonder, I mean, in terms of relative importance, where to start? Poverty profiles, attrition, and also it's like I'm not sure. I'm not sure which kind of literature this. I mean, I know that in the Capillary Jenkins paper, it's very prominent, but my sense is in many papers it is not that prominent, right? So maybe I'm mistaken and I have not a complete overview on the literature, but yeah. So yeah. So, but I'm also not immediate. It's not immediately obviously to me how to include that. I was thinking rather going the direction to think more about addressing heterogeneity in some dynamic random effects probit context, maybe pooling the data, going this direction that is currently used for monetary poverty measurement. Although I'm not sure whether that fully translates into our setting, and then potentially incorporate attrition along those lines as well. I'm not sure. So it's like I have question marks there. So what is the relative importance?
Great question. All right, other questions that we have in the last 30 seconds that I'll give for answers? You're very quiet, Jacob.
I don't think we have, I have some questions. I think I'll post them to Nicolai separately because we are otherwise running out of time.
Then I'll happily
contact to the speaker.
Then I'll happily shut it down at this point. Actually, I'll ask Philippe if he has any closing comments, and Nicolai if they have closing comments before we shut it down. All good?
All good.
All good.
Well, thanks for the invitation again.
Well,
thanks.
Great to
thanks
have.
for the discussion and the opportunity to present for both. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing you next week on our series on the Multidimensional Poverty Index. Until next week, bye-bye.